Hi everyone, this is Ann Mason with the Heritage Alliance and coming to you from the McKinney Center. We have our Stories and Stitches quilt exhibit up right now through August 7th. And as part of the exhibit, we're going to do an exciting Try It challenge all about crazy quilts. I have an example of a crazy quilt behind me. We have 3 in this exhibit, and if you want to come see it, you just need to call the McKinney Center and reserve a slot to come and see the exhibit. And we're also going to have a digital exhibit online as well. But this crazy quilt back here behind me, these were really popular in the late 1800s in the United States. We believe that they came out of the World's Fair in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania in 1876. And they were really influenced by Japanese motifs because there was a bunch of pottery there that had sort of like cracked glaze and these different sort of, piecing together within it that a lot of you Americans hadn't seen before. So they really responded to that. Now these were really popular during the Victorian time period, so 1870s through 1890s. You don't see too many of them when you get into the 20th century. And that whole era was named after Queen Victoria of England. That's how we get the Victorian time period, because she was ruling in England at the time. And it really, showcased, like the middle class and the upper class, because thanks to the Industrial Revolution, you had a class of people, the middle class, who now had more money to spend. So they would, part of that was making these beautiful, elaborate quilts, and they were intentionally fancy. A lot of things in the Victorian era were intentionally fancy because now you had people who had money to be able to afford, like the fabrics that would go into making this quilt. So they're like a really unique American phenomena that you see in the late 1800s, and we're really excited that we have 3 of them in this exhibit, and they're all 3 complete, and they're all 3 very different because there's no wrong or right way to do a crazy quilt. So you'll see that in just a minute, because Nancy with the McKinney Center is going to show you how to make a craft with a crazy quilt of your own.
Hi everybody, I'm Nancy Buffard with the McKinney Center, and I'm here today with Ann Defellers Mason, and we're going to work on presenting ideas for our Crazy Quilt Challenge. So we're going to be putting a challenge out for folks to submit a crazy quilt, and we're going to just show how to do, maybe it could be a draft or maybe it could be actual final artwork on paper. And talk a little bit about what makes up a crazy quilt. So the idea of a crazy quilt is that you use randomly varying sizes and shapes and colors and fabrics. And back in the Victorian era, as Ann has talked about, you might have seen velvets or parts of old wedding dresses, really fancy stuff. I'm just doing mine on paper today, but I pulled out some fabric we had at the McKinney Center, and you can see there are lots of fabrics that may have embellishment on it, images. All of these would work to piece together. Some might have textures. Here's some lace. So we're throwing it out there for you to think about what you might put together as a design and submit to us. So what I'm going to do here, I'll give you a piece too, and I'm going to give Ann a crayon. So we're going to be coloring on paper. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to design a square. So you can think of a quilt as being pieces blocked together. We know the crazy quilts were more ornamental. They didn't have the batting underneath it. It was more of a surface display of pieces put together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to design on my piece of paper within a certain block, so this could be considered one block, a design, something I think is interesting that I can then go back and color, put fancy stitches on, add embellishments. So you could also think about, would I want to make this a repeating pattern, or do I want to piece several of these together, or do I want to just have something that's just this size? So anything goes for this challenge. We're really open. So on my piece of paper, I'm going to draw maybe some irregular shapes that I might find appealing to color. I'm thinking I'm going to color these in. I'm going to attach them with stitches. So I'm just dividing up my piece of paper in a weird way. So that's part of the art with it. And if you think about it, if you are going to go to the next step to make this out of fabric, this might actually be your pattern that you use to then piece fabric together. So I'm going to color today with crayons, but think about how this could become a pattern for taking pieces of fabric, chopping up pieces of fabric and putting them on there and gluing it. Or if you went full-fledged to sew a quilt together, you would be piecing it, sewing the pieces together. I recommend a website, Pintangle, that is everything about Crazy Quilts, and you can learn all about how to make them, how to put the pieces together. And I just wanted to show you, here's a, sometimes you get wallpaper books, different books. Here's something that has paper that has different patterns on it. And that would be another idea for you to assemble pieces of paper that had different patterns. You could even use like magazine pages. There's so many options. So we're just kind of laying out the concept of what makes up a crazy quilt. How might it have been thought through when people were putting together the pieces of fabric earlier, and we're inviting you to create something and submit an image to us, and yours can be just on paper. So what we might do next with this is add some color. So here, have a box of crayons. And I might think about how the colors relate to each other within my different sections here. I might actually think about making a pattern. So that's another option that you could do to pretend you're replicating fabric right on the piece of paper. Some fabric has stripes in it.
Yeah, so people would put lots of things in their crazy quilts. Sometimes they'd write their name or the date they were making it. Sometimes they'd put like their favorite flower or a leaf from their favorite tree in it, or their favorite animal. So you can put all kinds of fun things in crazy quilts.
So because we're drawing, you could actually draw your name on it. But I went to our stash and pulled out a couple things. I pulled out some sticky things you could actually embellish by putting stickers on. And people put words sometimes, so you could put little words on here. In the original Crazy Quilts, I think you'd more likely see all of this done with embroidery and embroidery stitches. So if you come in and see an exhibit, you will see some pretty fancy embroidery stitches. And there are lots of reference out there on the internet for different embroidery stitches. But the way the Crazy Quilts were traditionally done was you would use fancy stitches in between the seams. So that was also part of the decoration, was the use of embroidery. So you could play around with adding different stitches to hold the different pieces of your Crazy Quilt together. What I'm doing is drawing some example stitches onto the seams in between the different sections of my quilt, and that is replicating some of the fancy stitches that you might see on a traditional quilt. So you can go onto Pintangle or go to another reference and find what the different names. There's herringbone and running stitch and feather stitch, and there's all these different fancy stitches that people would make an embellishment, so it's an addition onto the quilt. And there's always decision making involved, so that you can decide what stitches do you want to use, what would look really cool with maybe an idea that you're trying to get across. Maybe you're making a gift for somebody, maybe you want to talk about nature or sunshine. So there's so many opportunities of things that you can do with these Crazy Quilts. So these are just the elements. The elements involve the fabric that you choose. One element is that fabric. Another element are the stitches. So you could use different colors and threads and textures and different stitch types to embellish that way along the seams, but also right on the fabric itself. So you'll see embroidery of flowers and people's names right on the fabric itself. And then there's the other embellishments. So you could find some other fancy little doodad that you want to actually sew onto the Crazy Quilt. That's allowed too. There's ribbons, there's lots of things that could add maybe something gold or shiny, or something, you know, something that you're in love with and you want to just keep that in a special way. You might sew it onto your quilt. So that's sort of, wow, look at what Anne's got a lovely, lovely, very cohesive with your colors there too.
Thank you to Anne and Nancy for showing us the history of Crazy Quilts and how we can start to make our own at home. Please use paper, markers, glue, paint, fabric, stitches, however you'd like to make your own at home, and you could submit them here to us at the McKinney Center for our Try It Challenge Crazy Quilt in conjunction with our Stories and Stitches quilt exhibit here at the McKinney Center in partnership with the Heritage Alliance.